whenever there is someone who can act as a champion of new technologies and who can take on the kind of effort and the mental load of evaluating the technologies and then project managing their implementation, and if the people doing the day-to-day know that they have from their management the kind of flexibility to be able to try new things, and they're not going to be punished for it, that can go a long way. And then this is true for all events. This is true internally in my company.
Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Today's guest is Dr. Konstantinos Kyriakopoulos, co-founder and CEO of DeepSea Technologies. DeepSea Technologies brings the best of AI to the shipping industry to make vessels and voyages more efficient. Less fuel burned equals less cost and lower emissions. And this is something that I hope everybody's going to find of great interest, especially with all the attention we're getting on emissions and bettering a ship's CII and other ratings and reducing the impacts of emissions and pollutions. Konstantinos, welcome to the podcast.
Christopher, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on, and I appreciate it. I look forward to chatting because I think technology does play and digitization does play a big role in what is happening actually in another big area of our industry, and that's decarbonization. So talk to us today about where you are with kind of what you're doing at DeepSea Technology and maybe a little bit of background of kind of how you got here.
Sure. So my background is on the AI side. When we had the idea for DeepSea, I was doing my PhD in deep learning, actually applying it to speech applications. So in another life, I could have been working for ChatGPT now. And the other co-founder, Roberto, was very much from a shipping background. And so, basically we had one of those serendipitous encounters where I had a problem in search of a solution, and I had a solution in search of a problem, and he had a problem in search of a solution. At the time, actually, we began with a very specific problem, which was fouling estimation, right? How do you figure out how foul the hull of a ship is using only the data you have available about this performance? But from there, what we have eventually scaled it into is how can you use the latest in AI in order to use real data from vessels to build individualized models of each vessel that can predict the way the vessel will behave in different conditions, how much fuel it will consume, how much power it needs to maintain a certain speed, in different weather conditions, speed conditions, etc., bearing in mind that every vessel is different and that every vessel changes over time. And that's where fouling comes in. So you need to be able to use the data, not just to build the vessel model, but to actually update that vessel model to take into account all the unseen factors that are affecting the vessel. And so we really focused early on this modeling ability, on building a team of AI engineers and marine engineers who could really crack this problem of being able, given a vessel and data from that vessel, to predict the performance of the vessel in good weather and bad weather and with fouling and so on. And then we applied that first to monitoring and analytics, but then we realized having this model, what you really want to do with it is you want to use it to make more optimal decisions. Decisions are made about vessels every day, what speed it should go at, what combination of generator engines to use, when to clean it. And these are made often by a network of different parties, charterers, owners, operators, and so on. In many cases through these one-size-fits-all agreements, sometimes by the crew, sometimes through daily emails, but never with a robust understanding of what the impact of the decision will be on the bottom line of each of the pairs, right? And so we moved into the area of optimization, and we started off with speed and then route optimization. So given the vessel that wants to go from A to B with a given ETA, what is the best combination of speeds given the weather in order to get there with the minimum fuel consumption, right? And that, in order to really crack that, you need to have a very accurate model that can predict how different speeds will affect the fuel consumption. And so that's our product, Pythia, which is now live on hundreds of vessels around the world. And there are many speed optimization solutions out there, but by using our AI, we actually have one that can reliably and demonstrably and consistently reduce the fuel consumption without changing everything else, right? Because our accuracy of prediction is that good. And then starting from there, from speed, we added in the component of route, and then we added in the component of actual ETA selection. So you don't necessarily know your ETA. You have a total fuel consumption, which will be different. The optimized fuel consumption will be different at different ETAs. But then you also have an opportunity cost for each day you're late, because you could be using that vessel for something else. And so how do you calculate the optimum ETA end to end with the model that can actually predict what the fuel consumption will be on each ETA? So by just building these things on top of each other, we have now a framework where you're taking all these decisions in a single place, using an accurate model, using all the information you have, and we're using it to generate real monetary savings, but also real CO2 savings, and helping meet CII targets. And so it starts from there, and really where this ends is with the fully autonomous vessel, which is able to do all of this automatically in the most efficient way possible.
Well, I think that, so you brought up a few interesting topics. One, of course, was one of the last ones was the CII modeling. And I think that probably a lot of people are very interested in seeing that part, especially as we start to get some more granularity with the IMO. But I think as well, and I've always, there's a lot of people who said the IMO could have done better and all these other kind of opinions. I always think that the IMO factor of it is really just a guideline, right? And there's a lot of companies out there who want to do better than that. So certainly reducing the emissions and being able to show that, is a huge part of it. I think, as well as the optimization. What I find interesting, wearing kind of my former commercial hat, is that you could actually say, well, we could go a lot slower, still be within the charter party, but then our opportunity cost is X because, the market is rising and we need to get the ship back in our hands to put it in the market because we think there's an opportunity, on the positive side. That's a very interesting approach.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
The last thing I think you touched on, I think that's something that's not necessarily unique to our industry, but is going to be a part of it, and that's kind of the autonomous vehicles. Obviously, over the road is what most people in the world are familiar with, but AI and shipping, I think there's a lot of different opinions on that. When you talk to folks about that, well, what is their AI, I guess, on the part that you're doing is okay. I think a lot of people can understand, but you talk about autonomous shipping. Kind of how is your feedback? How are people feeding their feelings back to you, and where do you see this going here?
So the shipping industry is, in many ways, rightly a very conservative industry because there's a lot at stake, right? And people are very wary, and I think when you have a term like AI, which is a bit of a buzzword, you always are immediately met with skepticism. Okay, what is this? Come on, and so our approach has very much been to be very focused on proving what the actual value is at each step. Right. So it's not put AI on your ship because it's new and shiny and fancy. It's, I will show you that I can knock 7 to 12% off of your fuel costs without affecting your commercial outcome. And you need to prove that you can do it. And then you need to actually deliver it. And they need to be satisfied that you deliver it. And when you do it like that, and you have something that works, you can convince anyone, because it's for all different applications of AI in shipping, whether it's for modeling the commercial side of the market, or autonomy, or even bringing in natural language processing things. It's going to have to proceed like that, step by step, clear value proposition, thorough testing, telling people exactly what you're giving them and why at each step.
It seems on the kind of on the engineering side, are becoming accepting of this, because I imagine that when you do go into a company, there's somebody there who has been doing their job for 25-30 years, operations, and which including the optimization of the ship or the engineering side, and all of a sudden you come something, you kind of try to, well, literally and figuratively crack the code a little bit, which gets kind of interesting for somebody with respect to job security. I think that probably does come into play for some folks as a barrier, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we're not yet at the stage where we're offering something that will kind of eliminate anyone's job. I'm sure there will be applications like that at some point, as there is with every new technology. I would say more the barrier now is having to change the way people work. And it's easy to say, people are lazy, or they're stubborn, or they don't want to change. But actually, it's important to realize that when a new technology comes in that requires you to change the way you work, that actually takes a lot of effort and time, right? You have to stop. You're already, set aside some part of your already incredibly busy schedule in order to be trained on some new technology. You have to adopt it. You have to go through a phase in the beginning where it's you're still getting used to it, and there's going to be some missteps and so on. And then you have to adapt it. You have to onboard your captains and so on. So I think we found that we've been most successful in organizations that understood the scale of the task and had dedicated people to manage it and to manage the internal change management. We published a case study last year with Lennis Wilhelmsen, which I still think is the best example of this we've seen, just because they had the resources and the scale and the vision to do it. They had someone already in the company whose job it was to find new technological solutions.
Oh, that was Nicole Malhotra, correct? I mean, I think that's what I know.
Yeah,
he
that's
was,
right.
Yeah, because Nicole was he was on the podcast a while ago, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but he was on a podcast a while ago, and I think with his kind of focus on finding these solutions and then working with companies like yours, that's amazing that you guys did that. So I'm sorry, but you were talking about like kind of what they did on their case study.
Yeah. So they had a guy whose job it was to find solutions to these problems, right? Before when we came to him, he'd already rejected, I think, 8 different solutions. This person had the authority within the organization to have some vessels trial new technologies. And, these vessels knew that, in addition to doing their routes, they'd also have to use these various new systems that were to be tested. And you can imagine, if 8 were rejected, before coming to us, you can imagine what these people went through, but they did it. And then they picked us in the end. And then when it came for the rollout, there was a dedicated project manager whose job was to, onboard all the captains and all the operators and all the different, companies involved to use it effectively. And, this just made the process so much smoother. And of course, we recognize that not every company has, the ability to do this on the scale. But what we've done is we've taken this experience and we've used it to kind of craft our own operational processes to kind of be able to get as close to that as possible with kind of smaller customers and new customers. But even still, whenever there is someone who can act as a champion of new technologies and who can take on the kind of effort and the mental load of evaluating the technologies and then project managing their implementation, and if the people doing the day-to-day know that they have from their management the kind of flexibility to be able to try new things, and they're not going to be punished for it, that can go a long way. And this is true for all events. This is true internally in my company in terms of when because we're also suppliers. We're in addition to suppliers, we're also customers of various novel technologies as well, and we see the same thing internally with us.
And that's absolutely one of the most important things that have been happening. Really, since when I studied my MBA and even before that, is the whole concept of change management, right? I think that's one of the most important concepts that we we see bubbling up in any discussion that I have. It's how do you change people view or method of doing things without alienating workforce, without losing workforce, without losing kind of work efficiencies on a day-to-day, while trying to embrace a new technology that will hopefully make them or allow people to do their job better. And I think that that's one of the most important things. Explain a little bit more about, like, you talk about kind of the process with Wilhelmsen. Talk a little bit more about kind of maybe other companies that you've worked with, or other kind of other things that you've experienced where you've onboarded people, and kind of how to overcome some of that initial hesitancy. You mentioned you kind of started working on your own operations process for going into a new organization. Has that changed over time? Is that still the same thing? Can you talk a little bit about that? A little bit more about that?
In the beginning, our approach was just, here's our software. Do you want to try it? Right. It's now evolved to the point where we have a quite well-organized kind of discipline process, where we begin with a proof of value process. So we gather first data, and that could be data that we're gathering, or increasingly now it's data they already have. Actually, I should say, before we even get to that stage, we do a discovery process and a kind of customer validation process, right? Because a lot of customers are just not for us at the stage where we are now. Right. And so at the beginning we try to select the customers, right? And then we try to understand what the customer's actual need is, and whether their actual need is a thing we provide, because it might be something else. Right? It might be someone else who could cover their need, but that's, we don't want to waste it. Once we've done that and we go forward, we then collect the data and we do a data quality analysis. So we found that this is very important. Most people don't who have data from another source don't understand the quality of the data they have. People think they have 4 years of sensor data, but actually the sensor was miscalibrated for 3 of those years. And it's garbage if you're not using the data for anything day to day like we do. Because we're using the data every day to give every speed of every vessel. If you're just collecting it and it's sitting there and you're doing some analytics on it, you're not going to be evaluating data quality at the sort of level that's necessary. So we begin with this. We fix anything that needs to be fixed. Then we do an exercise where we test the accuracy of our model, prove to the customer the accuracy of the model, so they can see. We predict how much fuel you're going to consume, and then you consume it, and you can see the accuracy. And then we do an analysis of the optimality of a couple of their historical voyages and show what we would have suggested different. And then we start giving them suggestions. We do trainings with the operators and the captains on how to use it, and then they start following it, and then we start giving reports on the savings that were actually generated, and then we go for a decision. That's basically the high level process, and we communicate all this process at the beginning, and we try to be as transparent as possible about the kind of resources that are going to be needed on the side of the customer. Right? We're going to need someone on your side to project manage all this, who's going to be spending a lot of time on this, right? We're going to need to train captains and operators on how to use it, and then they're going to have to use it. If we find problems with your data, you're going to have to help us correct that problem, because if the data is wrong, you can't do anything. And this is going to be to your benefit in the long run, because you're probably using data for something else as well, and that's also wrong if your data is wrong. But you're going to have to bear with us to correct. And so it's important to understand that up front, and they're willing to make a commitment. And then if they are, we make it worth their while, because the ROI on a system like ours is can range from 20 to X to we've had 50X on some customers.
So really, at the end of the day, what sounds like is very interesting to me anyway, is that it's not just, it is plug and play to an extent, but to get to that point, you're going to need some help from the client, right? This is not just we're coming in and waving a magic wand and making things better. No, client, Mr. and Miss Client, or Mr. and Miss Client, you're going to need to do some of the lifting at the beginning with us, because we have to make sure that we get you the best, the highest ROI. In other words, in order for us to give you the maximum return, you're going to have to help out a little bit. And I think that's an interesting evolution, rather than, well, here's our product, so you should just buy it, which ultimately is still the same thing, but it's changed over time, which is very interesting. A little side story about data. When I was working for a ship owner years ago, one of the things that I would look at it is I would get from as a chartering guy, I would get from our engineering teams, I would get, and our technical manager, I would get, speed and consumption curves. We'd get those updated every month, right? So we didn't have a particularly large fleet. I think it was 12 ships at the time. And I'm going through the curves, just kind of looking at it, just, kind of going through. And I noticed on one of the speeds for one of the ships, and I think I forgot if it was laden or ballast condition, it went from, it jumped up 15 tons. And I'm like, in a month. And I'm like, that's almost impossible, right? Like I was like, the math just doesn't make sense, because I went back and I was like, they only had 2 days worth of data. How does this jump 15? Like, literally, I think somebody made an error. So I mentioned to the engineering department, they're like, no, our data is very good. No. So finally, a friend of mine looked at it and he goes, yeah, let me call the ship. And they entered in, instead of like 80 tons per day, they entered in like 800. So it threw the numbers off. And like, oh yeah, let me correct it. And then it went up.
No, by the way, this still happens all the time.
Right. And the funny thing is there was so much resistance.
Yeah.
Because I was in chartering and I found it. I got so much resistance from the head of technical. No, this is right. Mind your own business. Oh, okay. Well, my business is the chartering, and I want to make sure that I do this. And that I have my numbers right, until somebody looked at it and goes, no, this is not right. Made a quiet phone call, and then they corrected the numbers. But the point is like, if that happened 10 years ago on a relatively a small number of ships, I'm sure it happens elsewhere as well. And especially when you're dealing with much more data now. Again, just the amount of data in the last 10 years has to be exponential. So I'm sure you deal with this, like you said, all day long. And I think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges in our industry as a whole, is to get that right data in order to make the right decisions, especially around emissions and reductions there.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Now we're dealing with digital sensors. So, sensors that collect data every minute, they can also be inaccurate. So they can be miscalibrated, they can be variable. So
misplaced. Yeah.
Being able to automatically filter, clean, detect problems, and then kind of find the systematic problems and refer them back to the customer is a very, very important part of the process, and it should not be neglected. Without that, you can't do anything else.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an important thing. Well, one of the questions.
And sorry, just to go back to the story you told, you should not take it personally, right? Data is data. It's always like there's always problems with it. It's not your fault if the data that passes through your organization has problems.
Well, exactly. That's the way that I felt. I was like, this is coming from the tech managers. I'm like, somebody just asked the question, how did this go from like 71.7 to 85 in a month, where we kind of just drop off 1 month, we edited it. I forgot to take it was not like, and there was only a handful of data points. And I kind of like did the math roughly. I'm like, and I kind of I figured out the number by backwards doing this. I figured out the number. I'm like, they probably just put an extra zero in. No, they don't do that. There was something. All right, man, whatever you say.
Yeah, I suspect this is also, partially to do with the dynamics between ship owner and charter.
Well, we were all in the same company. I think it has to do with a lot of internal dynamics about, well, this is my department and other things. And again, it's just, it's not to knock anybody I work with, but it's just to talk about the organizational kind of internal barriers that really need to kind of be torn away. Again, there's still a level of accountability. I don't do certain things, departments don't do certain, but the sharing of data internally and then ultimately externally with charters, with third parties who need to see this data is such a huge part of what the decarbonization process. I mean, that's why the digital part plays such a huge part of the decarbonization process, I think. Speaking of the two kind of hot topics in the industry and kind of pivoting a little bit. So you come from a non-maritime background. If you go back to your university and as you were getting your PhD, what would you tell other people who are not shipping people? Why should they kind of join our industry? What kind of advice, what would you tell them?
I'm from Greece, so in Greece people perceive shipping a lot, but in the UK where I studied, shipping is something you don't really think of or talk about a lot until something goes very seriously wrong. Like when the Suez Canal was blocked, or when you can't get grain out of Ukraine, and yet 90% of all goods that we consume every day have traveled on ship. It is an omnipresent industry. It's everywhere. There's a lot going on. It is truly international. It's truly a free market, and there's just a lot of room in order to apply really any kind of set of skills or any novel technology you can think of, where not a lot of people will beat you to it, right? So this is a very exciting place to be in. It's incredibly dynamic. Something crazy happens every day. It really is thrilling to watch. I have no regret to this.
I think you hit on a really interesting topic that comes up often here when I talk to my guests, and that's kind of the industry itself is hidden but omnipresent. The only time you hear about our industry is when something goes bad, and I think you point to something that I point to almost on a regular basis on this podcast, and that is when when you can't get toilet paper because there's a ship sideways in the Suez Canal. Everybody freaks out about shipping, but 99.9% of the time when you can get your paper goods at wherever you go, or get your gasoline or what have you, then people don't think about it. And I think that that's one of the things that the industry can do a little bit better, and that's giving ourselves a better reputation in the long term, right? I think that's certainly one of the things that we could do better, and I think that would help attract more and more talent, and a more diverse pool of talent, not only in every sense of the word, right? I think is important, because I think people like yourself who come in who don't have a background, you're aware of it more than others because of where you grew up in Greece. The people there, people like yourself who have an understanding are a little more apt to it, but the guy sitting next to you who's maybe from a landlocked country in Europe, or a landlocked country in the African continent, or South America, maybe he or she gets really interested in it, but they don't necessarily have much of a background. I think that's super important. That's what hopefully technology can kind of help here.
We have a team that, by the nature of what we do, mixes shipping people with non-shipping.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. I think if you have too many technology people, they won't understand the problem, right? And if you have too many shipping people, for the most part, they won't understand the best way to get to the solution.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's a very interesting dynamic when you put the shipping people and the non-shipping people together. You have the right shipping people and the right non-shipping people. It's a beautiful thing, and this enormous amount of creativity comes out of these different perspectives meeting.
I think that is I could speak from personal experience. I'm a product manager at Vesson, and I started off with Q88, and one of the things in my product group, we had a lot of shipping people, in the sense of people who worked for shipping companies with technology for a long time. One of the guys was a regional manager of a software company, and then we also had a bunch of folks like myself who were on the commercial side, who were other side. And it really, when you sit down with, let's say, the engineers, and you explain to them a problem, sometimes they say, well, I don't know what that, like, Chris, you've said this like 3 times now. What is demurrage. Like, oh, okay, wait a minute. And then you have to wind back and, oh, okay. So, you explain to it. And then once they get the concept, because, it's not a difficult concept, it's just a new word or used in a certain way. They, like you said, they could think about like, well, Chris, you told me X. I said, yes. Well, what if I gave you Y? And then all of a sudden it gets, it's pretty cool that they're able to figure that out, that you could, they could give you a feature or something based on a conversation and based on some back and forth. And that's a super positive thing, I think, for our industry, for sure.
That's exactly right.
As we wrap up, I love to ask this question, or I like to ask a question, and I kind of have a few. I'm going to change this next year, and I used to ask what book you read. Who is your hero of fiction, if you have one? I've had a few good answers so far. When you think about fiction and kind of your heroes or heroines, who do you look at there?
I'm gonna go for Daedalus. Yeah, like Daedalus and Icarus.
No, okay, go ahead. You got to explain.
You don't know the story? No, you
No.
definitely heard the story. Maybe you don't know the names, right? He's the ancient Greek myth. They're kind of the first engineers. Daedalus is the guy that built the labyrinth in which they stored the Minotaur.
Oh, okay.
And then after that all went wrong, he was imprisoned in the labyrinth together with his I think it was son, Icarus. And so Daedalus invented these wings, which they attached by wax to his back, and then they had a pedaling mechanism to fly. It's actually a very interesting early description of kind of a flying machine. And then they both flew out to escape. And then, the more famous part of the story is that Icarus flew too close to the sun, the wax melted, and then dropped into the sea. But I kind of, it's a story I first heard when I was very, very young, like 3 or 4, and it's sort of always stuck with me. And it was, I think, probably my first exposure to the concept of engineering.
That's very interesting. I love hearing this because people tie certain things together in ways that you don't even think about. And I appreciate that. So I have to maybe read up. Maybe our listeners will have to read up on that part of the story, because I think most people are familiar with the Icarus part of the story, but not that part for sure.
So the Icarus part of the story is about the kind of folly of arrogance and flying too close to the sun and melting.
Hubris, right? Yeah.
Hubris. But behind it, there's this other really interesting story of engineering and resourcefulness and innovation.
Well, and that sounds like it ties in exactly what you guys are doing and what the industry as a whole is doing, for sure. So, Konstantinos, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. This was an enlightening view on not only what you're doing, but really an enlightening chat about change and kind of in our industry and approaches. And I think that's kind of an overlooked part of the technology that we're talking about, and that's the change management that needs to take place, and it needs to be accepted, not necessarily by the companies inventing things, but by the companies, the eventual consumers. So thank you for coming on the podcast. I much appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a very interesting conversation for me as well, and hope to talk to you again in the future.
Absolutely, we'll see you around.